Good afternoon. I am a first-time author, and I am thrilled to be here. This was a true labor of love. I researched my topic for 3 years and spent a year plus writing it. And it is humbling and gratifying to see it be so well received and to be following Walter Isaacson, Robert Caro, and Tony Horowitz. I came to develop a strong interest in Paul Jennings when I was Director of Education at James Madison's Montpelier in Virginia. I was familiar with Jennings' memoir, considered by the White House Historical Association to be the first memoir of life in the White House. It was titled A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison. And as the title implies, it's really more about the so-called great man than it was about the author himself. But my interest was in Paul Jennings, and I set out to discover elements of his own biography, to uncover the circumstances behind the original publication of the memoir in 1865, and to find and interview living direct descendants. A Slave in the White House, Paul Jennings and the Madisons, is the story of Paul Jennings' unique journey from slavery to freedom. It played out in the highest circles of ideas and power, the White House, James Madison's study. It's the story of Paul Jennings' complicated relationship with the father of the Constitution, James Madison. Jennings was the constant servant in James Madison's study. And as Madison would discuss the political subjects of the day and during his retirement, review his life's work defining and defending natural rights and self-government, Paul was there to hear it all. And in the book, I developed the thesis that he was able to absorb the theoretical underpinnings that would allow him to identify his innate yearning for freedom as a natural right of man. Jennings and Madison developed a close bond of mutual respect, but they never were able to altogether bridge that very deep divide between white elite and black slave. Nevertheless, Jennings had reason to expect that he would be freed by the terms of James Madison's will. When this did not happen, he was given to understand that Madison and his wife Dolly had come to an understanding before he died that she would free all the 100 Montpelier slaves at her death. And indeed, when she wrote a will of her own a few years after that, she had a term giving freedom to my mulatto man Paul, the only slave so treated. She and her son by her first marriage, Payne Todd, who plays the role of foil to Jennings in the book. Payne Todd had every advantage in life and squandered them. Jennings had no advantages, but managed to carve out a life of meaning, nevertheless. So Dolly and her son Payne were selling slaves a mere 2 months after her husband died. Now, in 1838, Dolly Madison moved back to Washington. She owned a house on Lafayette Square, just a block away from the White House. Well, Paul Jennings was an integral member of her household staff. So, like it or not, he went back to Washington too. He had come of age in Washington, serving on the Madison domestic staff from age 10 to age 18. and he had considered running away when that period of time was up, but instead, in the end, had gone back to Montpelier. After all, it was his home, too. He wasn't ready to never see his mother and other kin and connections again. And he was the only eyewitness who left an account at the death of James Madison. But now, Dolly Madison was selling Montpelier, and that separated Jennings from his own wife and children. He had married an enslaved woman at a nearby plantation to Montpelier, and that meant that their 5 children, as they came along, were owned by his wife's owner. They had barely been able to get together but once a week, and now Jennings was moving from Virginia altogether. And his wife dies about the same time. So now these are motherless children back in Virginia, the youngest only 2 years old. Now Dolly is hurting financially even after selling Montpelier. She hires Jennings out to work in the James Polk White House. So he has a second experience working in the White House. And at one point, the president and Dolly gave him permission to go back to Virginia to visit his family. But he stayed longer than Dolly approved. And now he was on her bad side. And he determined that he could wait no longer for his autonomy, for his freedom. And that's when he went to Senator Daniel Webster from Massachusetts. Even if a slave, it helps to know people in high places. And Jennings knew that Webster had come to the aid of other slaves in need, but he said he could never own a slave, so his MO was to extend the purchase price and then have the newly free individual work for Webster in his household to pay off the purchase price. And that's the deal that he struck with Jennings. Dolly sold Jennings for $200. And Webster allowed Jennings to pay back the purchase price at the rate of $8 a month. But he freed him immediately. So finally, at age 48, Paul Jennings is a free man. And his story after his freedom is as compelling as the one before that event. He became a leading member of the Washington Free Black community. And in 1848, he was an operative in an Underground Railroad activity that turned out to be the largest scale ever attempted slave escape, known to historians as the Pearl Episode. 77 enslaved men, women, and children of Washington, including a runaway teenage slave of Dolly Madison's named Ellen Stewart, boarded a schooner and hid themselves in the hull, hoping to make it to freedom in the North. But it was not to be. Their plan was foiled by contrary winds and by a turncoat in the black community. The schooner left the harbor, but immediately there were but light winds on the Potomac. That really slowed the vessel down. But then when it finally got to the Chesapeake, the winds were too rough to enter the bay. They had to hunker down. With the informant, that meant that the white owners back in Washington became aware sooner instead of later, this was a Sunday now, that their slaves had masterminded, working with white northern abolitionists as well as local black operatives like Paul Jennings, an escape. And they were after them, found them, and pulled the schooner back to Washington along with its human cargo. And those on board now faced the fate they most dreaded, which was sail to the Deep South and permanent separation from home and family.